his words. There are actions being taken, and further action will continue to be taken, and we stand by this commitment, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise tonight to follow up on a question I asked of the Prime Minister just before the holidays, which feels particularly relevant now in advance of the 2024 budget. At the time, I'd asked why the Prime Minister and this federal government hadn't yet funded the Canada Disability Benefit when they seemed to have tens of billions of dollars to throw at expanding a leaky pipeline. At the time, rather than answering my question, the Prime Minister read back a stock answer. And so I'd like to get into more detail tonight and hopefully have a more meaningful conversation. Because here's the reality. Budgets are about priorities. And there are many pressing priorities in my community that require significant investment. I'll offer just a few this evening. Of course, we need to end legislated poverty for our neighbours living with disabilities. If we did so, we could cut poverty by 40%, because 40% of people living in poverty across the country are people with disabilities. Priorities include building the affordable housing we need at the scale and the pace that we need to do so. Even if we doubled the social housing stock in this country, we'd still just be middle of the pack in the G7 as a result of 30 years of underinvestment in housing. Priorities that include incentivizing homeowners to retrofit their homes to be more energy efficient. Things like insulating attics and improving building envelopes. We could do it by replenishing and expanding the Greener Homes Grant program to even fund deep energy retrofits when that program right now is no longer even accepting applications in Ontario. We could do it by investing in public transit to avoid more fare hikes and reduce service, by accelerating and expanding the Permanent Public Transit Fund. Now, to pay for these items, myself and others in the past have suggested new revenue tools like the Canada Recovery Dividend to be applied to the oil and gas industry the way it already has been to banks and life insurance companies. Even just a 15% windfall tax on their profits over $1 billion could generate $4.2 billion to fund these kinds of solutions. But another option, and the one that I focused on in this question, is to stop wasting our money on projects like the TMX pipeline. Projects like these, new fossil fuel infrastructure in the midst of a climate crisis, are what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls, his words not mine, moral and economic madness. As recently as November 30th of last year, though, this government quietly guaranteed a new $1.75 to $2 billion in commercial loans for the Trans Mountain Corporation for expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now, if that money is borrowed, the project's total costs are going to grow to $35 billion. That is well in excess of $1,200 for every Canadian taxpayer in the country. And so to close, budgets are about priorities. And this budget is an important moment for this government to align their priorities with those of folks in my community and across the country. The Parliamentary Secretary is a reasonable person. I wonder if he would agree that it's past time we stop throwing Canadians money at expanding a leaky pipeline and use those funds to invest in Canadians who need it the most, like Canadians with disabilities. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my friend for his question. I will return the compliment and say I find him to be quite a reasonable individual, too. I feel like I'm facing the wrong way here. I want to thank him for his question. When it comes to our energy future, I would refer the member to the recent report of the International Energy Agency, which stated that global demand for oil and gas will continue in some form for decades, but overall demand for oil and gas will peak in this decade. At the same time, the deployment rate of renewables and uptake of electric vehicles is soaring. In his original question, the Prime Minister responded by affirming that Canada will continue to push forward to meet our net zero targets, including our commitment at COP28 to lower the production emissions and consumption of fossil fuels over the coming decades. Part of that includes the proposed cap on the oil and gas sector pollution in December. It was another step in our commitment to creating pollution cap on emissions that are both ambitious and achievable. The emissions cap is one that will ensure that the economic well-being of Alberta's energy sector does not come at the expense of our environment by incentivizing investments in decarbonization, in technological innovation, and in efficiency. Canada is the first major oil and gas producing country in the world to have done this. Allow me to quote Dr. Rob Barnes from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, who said, "This announcement marks a significant turning point. Canada is the first major fossil fuel producing country to commit to capping emissions from oil and gas production. We recognize the Canadian government's leadership on this and urge other countries to follow." In addition to the cap on emissions from this sector, we are also supporting energy producers to drive down methane emissions at least 75% through world-leading environmental standards. Despite fear-mongering from the Conservatives in this House, 12 major companies said that thanks to this regulation, they would nearly eliminate methane emissions by 2030. That is incredibly encouraging news for the climate and for the workers in these competitive industries. We know that the responsible path forward, Mr. Speaker, is to invest in decarbonization and in clean energy development to ensure workers have a bright future and that communities have clean air. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party's plan is to let the planet burn. The plan is to axe the environmental protections, to axe job-creating projects, and put moratoriums on renewable energy projects, as they have already done in Alberta or are trying to do in Atlantic Canada. While the Conservatives block vital legislation like the Sustainable Jobs Act and our offshore wind bill C-49, Liberals are working hard to ensure that communities across this country benefit from the opportunities presented by a low-carbon future. The Liberal plan has delivered over $200 billion of investment into clean energy and clean economy, helping to create thousands of sustainable jobs for workers today and future generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact remains, when it comes to investing in a sustainable future, you can't do it by buying and expanding a pipeline. And that's exactly what this government has been in the midst of doing since 2018. And as recently as November of last year, continued to double down on that investment to the tune of $2 billion more in a new subsidy to continue with this failed investment, at a time when Canadians across the country are calling out for something as simple as investing in home energy retrofits, in expanding public transit, in ending legislated poverty for people with disabilities. Will the parliamentary secretary use the influence he has inside of his caucus to shift these kinds of investments towards the priorities of his community and mine?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, we share the same priorities, but allow me to illustrate my earlier point by sharing some of the investments the Government of Canada has made in Southern Ontario, where the member and I are both from. For example, we provided $3 million to Kitchener-based Kuntz Electroplating, Inc. to strengthen its manufacturing capabilities, creating 45 new jobs in the automotive and EV industry and support the growing green economy. We invested $10 million in the University of Waterloo's aeronautics program to help them orient to a more sustainable future for the aviation industry. In the auto sector, we've attracted major investments from companies like Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Umicore, which will create thousands of good quality and low-carbon jobs for our community. This is just the beginning, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue on this path forward and accomplish our goals together. Thank you.
I thank all members. The motion to adjourn the House is now deemed to have been adopted.